Welcome to the Authentic Change Podcast. I'm Mike Horn, your host, and this podcast is for leaders and coaches who need and want fresh perspectives on what it means to live and to lead authentically. You're a leader who wants to make a difference, but sometimes you feel stuck. You know there's more to life and to leadership than what you're currently experiencing. It can be tough to figure out how to grow as a leader. You might be reading all the blogs and books, but it still feels like you're not making progress. You might even be feeling like you're doing everything wrong. On Authentic Change with Mike Horn, we interview experts who share their insights on how to live and lead authentically. Our guests are trendsetters in building great leaders, teams, and organizations. We provide fresh perspectives on what it means to live with purpose and authenticity. Welcome to this episode of the Authentic Change Podcast.
Welcome to this episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horn. I am absolutely delighted to have in the virtual studio today Caleb Gardner. And he has a career that has been driven by curiosity and one that's focused on change. So I know that for everyone in our listening audience, these are two topics that are so central to the work that we do in organization development and executive coaching, in fostering authentic leadership, these ideas about curiosity and change. So let me say a few words about Caleb before I ask him to introduce himself. For more than 3 years, he was the lead digital strategist for OFA, Barack Obama's political advocacy group. Caleb led one of the largest digital programs in existence, including the most followed Twitter account in the world, at Barack Obama. But his decades of experience in digital leadership, entrepreneurship, and social impact don't just include work in government and politics. He's built operational frameworks for a variety of organizations in the public and private sectors, including at prestigious professional service firms like Bain & Company and Edelman. Now, as the co-founder and managing partner of 18 Coffees, an innovation consulting firm, Caleb helps businesses with a mission to change the world get a foothold in the future using his professional experience to solve impossible problems and bring new ideas to life for global clients such as United Way Worldwide, Bose Corporation, and others. Caleb has written columns for Forbes and other online publications and is frequently asked for quotes for publications like NBC News, Crane's Chicago Business, Wired Magazine, BBC Radio 4, and Entrepreneur Magazine, among others. Today, Caleb speaks, trains, and teaches part-time at the University of Chicago on topics related to innovation, marketing, and change management. His new book, No Point B, Rules for Leading Change in the New Hyper-Connected, Radically Conscious Economy, is out in all major bookstores. So, Caleb, I'm just delighted to have you on Authentic Change with Mike Horn. Can you say a few words about yourself that takes us beyond that lovely biography that you have?
Thanks so much. Yeah, what a great intro. Just overwhelmed hearing all the random things that I've done. I mean, I guess what you could add to that is I'm also a father, live in Chicago with my 3 kids and my wife. I also play music. I also briefly went to seminary, which is something that people don't know about my resume, before switching and being more focused on business. So yeah, I'm a man of many hats and interests.
Well, thank you again. What do seminaries and business have in common?
For me, it had in common wanting to improve people's lives. Like I was always focused on, how can I just, do the most good in the world? And at first it looked like theology would be a pathway to that. And I eventually got super interested in the power of business and economics to kind of, turn the engines of capitalism, let's say, in a better direction. And I really think that, my career's done a lot. I've done a lot of things in my career, but it's always kind of had that same energy of just being able to make people's lives better.
Everyone can find out more about Caleb at 18coffees.com. And certainly you can follow him on Twitter at Caleb Gardner and read more about him on LinkedIn at Caleb Gardner and have a means to interact with him in those forums.
Probably too easy to get a hold of, to be honest. Too many places on the internet that I'm available to chat with.
Yeah. I thought about, and I hopefully I've had a career that is about doing good in the world all through business. But I directed my energies towards the Peace Corps early on about doing good in the world. But that came from a long history of being involved in social action, particularly with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta on the lettuce boycotts in the
Amazing.
late 70s and the early 80s. So talk about this relationship, though, with what led you to OFA, and eventually how did this journey come to 18 coffees?
Well, I think there's some intentionality there, and there's some serendipity. I think that I majored in history and studied the U.S. presidency when I was an undergrad, and was always interested in politics and social justice, and there was always a strain of that. And then that was kind of the intentionality part, I guess, in terms of things that I was interested in. But then I kind of serendipitously took this path through business school and found out that I was really interested in things like digital marketing and the transformation to digital, especially I saw as having this really great opportunity to shift power from some of the most powerful companies and institutions in our country back to the individual. I think that, eventually over the next 20 years, we saw the good effects of that and the bad effects. But, leaning into that and developing expertise around that led me to helping build the digital strategy team at Edelman, which really helped me interface with people from the Obama organization, just being based in Chicago and learning all about, Senator Barack Obama at that time and being in close proximity with people helping build his campaign. So that was kind of being at the right place at the right time, I would say.
So tell me about what, this interest in digital marketing and what led you to Barack Obama.
Obviously, just interested in being a part of history, I think it's the thing that led me to the president at the time. I mean, I remember listening to the Obama podcast when he was a senator and, following his announcement very closely and starting to be involved in the campaign on a volunteer basis. So that, just a personal interest there, but the serendipitous kind of crossing of me becoming a little mastered and developing an expertise in digital marketing and especially social media right around that time when it was gathering steam as an influential force in our country, and having the experience of working for brands that were really building communities of hundreds of thousands of people just gave me the, some experience to be able to take into that world. And then simultaneously had, friends who left Edelman and actually went to work on the 2012 campaign. I got to know the chief technology officer from the campaign and a few people who really went from, the private sector into that. And that became, just ways to get to know people and network my way into, doing something extraordinary with the president.
Your new book, No Point B, Rules for Leading Change in the New Hyperconnected, Radically Conscious Economy. What is No Point B? Is there some sequence there? Is there an A or a B? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, the conceit of the book is that we tend to think that change is a linear process. And if we can just get to the point B, we'll be done and everything will settle and we'll get back to normal. And the argument that I make is, no, actually, we have to constantly be dealing with disruption and dealing with, new data, new entry points, new, ways of looking at the world that are different, and that building that adaptive capability as an organization is something that we need to be thinking about doing all the time, because there's no stopping. Yes, we just went through a global pandemic and we had kind of a once in a generation moment of change that was a forcing function, but actually there's disruptive things like that we don't realize underneath the surface happening all the time. And so we can't just, unfreeze the organization, make a change, and then say, okay, we're done. We actually have to be constantly adapting.
So what is adaptive capability? You used a word around unfreezing, which sort of resonates with me as a Lewinian scholar, but
I would define adaptive capability as, being able to change our thinking and the ways that we work quickly, and building in capability into our teams and into our management structures, into the way that we work every day, the ability to, move quickly, move faster than we are actually moving right now.
So interesting. I, certainly don't get to talk to many people like you. with this background in digital technology. And as you think about that, I mean, what is authentic in that regard? How do we start to make sense of what's real and what's authentic, what's the whole cloth, what's the real deal in terms of digitization? And certainly you've had a front row seat to all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that a ton. So I think that's a really interesting question. And I would say that, there's a whole chapter in my book that's about the effects of the internet on the workplace. And, I make the argument that in some ways the internet makes making change easier, and in some ways it makes it harder. And the part of the way that makes it harder is that it is harder to tell what is real. I mean, and I don't just mean, because we are experiencing persuasive messaging from lots of different media outlets, from our social networks every day, and we are trying to sort out our experiences of what people are saying online, what is truth and what is fiction. But also we are doing that at the same time as a lot of us are in remote work environments, and we are getting inbound from our peers and our managers and our, HR department. And we are trying to sort out what is real and what is false from what we are hearing from each other. And I think that there can be a distrust. Like we've gotten used to there being a little bit of cynicism and distrust in how we experience messaging. And we've taken that into the workplace as well. And some of the things that are being said about our company externally, for example, we take back internally. And so one of the things that I highlight in the book is that we don't pay enough attention to the overlap between internet culture, which it has become popular culture and media culture, and our workplace culture. And so in that way, making change is harder because we have to, be moving on both those fronts at once. And we have to actually invest in our own persuasive messaging, invest in, both from a defensive standpoint, but also proactively telling people we're moving in the right direction. And we usually don't have that capacity from an internal comms perspective. We haven't resourced against it. But in the way that it makes it easier is that we can organize people better. We have the tools to be able to get more data points about how people are feeling about where we are going. And we can use tools like we used in the Obama organization to make change at a broader scale that we wouldn't have been possible were it not for the kind of technology we can rely on today. And so it's more complicated. It takes a multifaceted effort, but it's a fun time to be, thinking about making change within our organizations, I think.
What's the intersection there between internet culture and workplace culture? Maybe how do you think about workplace cultures?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more overlap there than we give credit for, especially because we've individualized work so much being, at home. I've got my multiple screens up and I've got my Slack group here and I've got my Twitter stream here. And, there's so much inbound in terms of persuasive messaging happening, and the walls come down between what we actually consider our workplace culture and what we consider, internet culture in a way that I think we don't appreciate every day. I think it's harder to do the work of culture building in a workplace, in a remote work environment. It's not impossible. I've seen many of my clients do it really intentionally and thoughtfully. But I think that's one of the reasons why we see so much forced return back to the office right now, because I think that managers are really cognizant of how much easier it is to build workplace culture when you are in person. It's a balance between why are you bringing people back into the office and how do you make the case that the office is a better place to be and we're going to build that culture together. So it's a weird time. Like I think that workplace culture is an output of the effort that we put in. So as long as we're putting in the right inputs, that's where it's going to end up in a healthy place.
I've been moving away from culture in the workplace, and having led several campaigns to build great places to work and get recognition from external sources about those great places to work. Certainly I began to think about, well, it's not about the great place to work, but it's about where people can do their best work. And as we've moved through the last several years, I've also been talking and writing and thinking less about culture and more about community. And how do we get, 2 or 3 people to connect in a distributed environment more widely? And I think you mentioned some of the challenges that it is, for some, much more difficult to create this affirming sense of culture without physical presence. Maybe it's that we like to smell each other. I'm not sure, but how
Well,
are
I
you
think
doing that? I mean, what are some of the ways that you and your clients are doing that?
we just don't get the same feedback mechanisms when we're not in person, right? Like we don't, if you think about it from a communication standpoint, they say something like 90% of your communication comes from your body language. We don't get as much body language over Zoom or over Slack or whatever it is. Like we're missing a lot of that, and we're creating space for misinterpretation and frustration. And, there are productivity implications of that, but there are also just cultural implications. And so I think you have to be extra cautious and double the amount of effort for how you communicate. I think you have to create opportunities for in-person gatherings if you're not doing in-person work. So outside events, conferences that you attend together, there's lots of ways to do that where you make up the ground for that relationship building that can only happen in person with some more intentionality. There are ways to do it with culture building events, via Zoom, but I just think they're harder. I think it's harder to get right, and people just don't enjoy it as much because we've all got Zoom fatigue, but I think that there's the clients that I have that are thinking about it more creatively are mixing the right amount of in-person, collegiality, let's say, with over extending the communication piece online so that people have maximum amounts of clarity.
What does it mean to double up the communication? I mean, we're so bombarded with the words, but what does that mean to double up on the amount of communication?
I mean, I think it's literally doubling the frequency with which you communicate. I think if you were going to send one email, you send 3. I think if you were going to talk about something in a Teams channel or a Slack channel, you do it more than you think that you are going to need to. Basically, this is something that I thought about a lot coming from a comms background. It's once we get sick of hearing about something and talking about something is usually when it starts to penetrate the people that we are trying to reach. I think that's true when you're a marketer and you're trying to reach consumers. I think it's true if you're an internal comms, HR, senior leader person, and you're we've talked about this change initiative or this shift in strategy or whatever it is so much that people are getting sick of it. And no, it's probably just you getting sick of it, and the rest of the people are just now starting to understand.
Yeah, I often talk about that with my clients, is that it's the consistency and it's the persistency of the messaging.
Yes.
And I find that many of the successful executives with whom I'm privileged to work deliver on that message consistently. And it's not just one and done, but it's a multi-year approach to delivering the same message or a similar message in a variety of ways and in different forms. But those who are really successful at bringing more of who they are to what they do and adding value to their organizations are able to deliver a certain message consistently. Yeah.
And we should obviously caveat that the message isn't going to work if it's not backed up by action, or if you're not going to be able to sell some people on a product that actually doesn't work, right? There needs to be a combination of focus on persuasive messaging more so than you think that you're going to, but then actually back it up with the right kind of change and getting the right people involved, and actually catching up in the areas that you claim that you are catching up in.
I have a colleague, Dino Cataneo, and you can hear Dino on an earlier podcast on authentic change. And Dino has a firm or a tagline, authentic leadership for everyday people. And as I tell him on his podcast, he is everything but an everyday person by pedigree, by so many things. And so I'm wondering about, how do you create inclusion, given our electronically mediated environment for many professionals today? And how does that really begin to work?
That's where I feel like our technology can actually be helpful. We can get more data points from the right kinds of marginalized groups, for example, about their experience with their managers, about their workplace, about, we've got touch points in terms of how we scale up one-to-one communication, one-to-one feedback mechanisms that we didn't used to have. And so there are ways to gather with some intentionality those kinds of experiences. It isn't just about what does everyone want, what does the majority want, but what is the experience of everyone, and how can we make sure that people are brought along.
Now, I'm sure that our audience, and they'll find this in the show notes, they'll be able to learn more at 18coffees.com. But how did that come about? What's the idea with 18 Coffees? And
Yeah. My business partner and I both come from similar backgrounds in terms of coming from the agency, communications, and digital strategy world. And we also bring in, different backgrounds in terms of my political background. But we really felt like there was a market opportunity and something missing from the market when we started the firm, which was we want to help people with transformation and change management as it relates to doing some of this big, hard, transformative work of being digitally enabled, being more socially conscious, because there are a lot of methodologies out there for changing an organization. And there are a lot of new ambitious programs being launched around being more digitally innovative, being more socially thoughtful in terms of, DEI or ESG capabilities, or even like product ethics and some of these more like forefronts of trying to be, business or socially responsible as business. We felt like there weren't a lot of people that could look at those new innovative strategies and say, here's how we're going to bring everyone along with that. Because of what we were talking about in terms of no point B, it's not a one and done thing. We're always going to be learning more about how we should be socially conscious. We're always going to be learning more about what technologies are coming down the pike that are going to give us new consumer opportunities, new opportunities for revenue, new opportunities for data collection. And so we needed a new methodology and a new, for us, a new firm focused on just that. And that's really the niche that we have carved out and what 18 Coffees is about.
if authenticity is in some ways about congruency, a congruency between what I say and do, and even better, what I think, say, and do. How does that play into corporate messaging? I hear that term. It feels like sort of big brotherish, but it doesn't have to be, I guess.
No, it doesn't. I think congruency is the right way to think about it. I just think that we haven't. I say we being the collective we in terms of like leadership at a lot of companies haven't really thought through what we actually believe in enough to be congruent. Like I think that we often have these ancient foundational mission, vision, value statements that we're relying on, or nothing. Like we are literally just making it up on the whims of the next CEO. And so it's hard to be authentic when we don't know where we're going or what we stand for. If you can do some of that foundational work first, I think that it's much easier to then be in the everyday minutia of how that authentic experience should play out in how we talk about this one product at this one time, or what the next tweet should look like, or whatever that, tactical thing is. I just think that work of establishing congruency way up that value chain doesn't often happen.
Well, it's so true. I think that how do we get people to connect with mission and purpose? And at the same time, while we're often in the do mode, I think particularly so many executives are in the do mode.
Yeah.
What I encourage people to do is to use one of the oldest technologies that's available to us and just say hello to somebody. And it might, open up a conversation. So how is it that you get individual executives, you work with executive teams, you work with senior leaders in organizations? How is it that you are getting them to connect with mission and purpose, given that so many of us are attracted to working in purpose-driven organizations?
I think that we benefit from a lot of the people that come our way in the first place are already, let's call them purpose-driven leaders. Like even if they don't have it documented, or part of the work that we're doing is putting it on paper, but they are open and empathetic to the idea of this is how we want to do business. I think we benefit from that. I think we search that out too. And so, I think it's part that's how we positioned ourselves in the marketplace in terms of the kind of work we want to do, and people recognize that and it's appealing. And part like we go looking for people who are doing really interesting work at those frontiers and try to partner with them.
Now, when members in our audience go and purchase No Point B, Rules for Leading Change in the New Hyper-Connected, Radically Conscious Economy, are they going to find a step-by-step guidebook that will take me from A to B to C, or how's that going to work?
There's definitely some practical advice. I didn't want to make it just, esoteric and philosophical, but I will say that it's complicated work. That's really, part of the work I did with my agent, for example, when we were conceptualizing the book, is like, how do we take this, very wide ranging conversation about technology and how it affects the workplace and how we need to think about reframing the way that we change, both on an individual level and a systemic level, and then like bring it down practically to how leaders need to apply these principles to their everyday teams. Like, it was a lot of work to even kind of bring that under the scope of one book as much as we could. It's probably realistically under the scope of multiple books, but at least for this book, right? And so there are, at the end of each chapter, I basically framed up the book like, here are 9 basic rules for how change is different today than it used to be. And then at the end of those chapters, I try to make it applicable to like, here's how we should be working differently. And then as you go through the book, each chapter builds on itself a little bit. And so it's like, if these are the principles of how we think about how we change as individuals, for example, here's how those individuals work within teams and how that plays out in team dynamics. And then here's what leaders need to think about bringing those teams along. And then here's how organizational leaders need to think about organizing those teams of people who are systems within systems within systems, right? So it gets more practical as it goes along too. But it's definitely not, I would say, a practical guide in the way that I've read some other practical guides. It's still like, here's a big idea about how we need to be thinking about change differently, I think.
What are some of the big ideas that you're working with your clients today? And, as a way of connecting our audience to the work that you do at 18 Coffees.
Yeah, we are doing some interesting work right now around reconceptualizing the role of HR and positioning HR as an equity leader, both in terms of competitive benefits and salary, like we've normally talked about equity, but also just in terms of thinking through how do we make diversity and inclusion everyone's responsibility within the organization, and what can HR do to push the organization forward in that respect. We're doing some interesting work around how people organize themselves to be able to do ESG reporting and how we measure that and report back on it accurately, but also how we, to your point about culture change, like get everyone excited about that work and involved in it in really concrete ways and change the culture of the organization around to be able to do that kind of reporting. We're doing some interesting just innovation work around conceptualizing some new advocacy groups that we're launching. We're moving on a few different fronts right now.
It's so interesting. I think about a lot of the work that I did with colleagues at America Speaks and other organizations on large scale change, and getting 1,000 people into a room, getting 5,000 people into a conversation.
Sure.
Are you thinking about those techniques as well, or does it become much more individualized in the work that you do? I mean, how, or is it some of all?
Yeah, I'd say it really depends on the scope of work we have with each client, but it's very hard to think about making organizational change without thinking about changing individual mindsets. And so part of what we do is the kind of larger change management strategy. The part of what we do is individual coaching and training. I think in an ideal world, every engagement would include a little bit of all of that, right? Like, let's think big picture and systematically together and how we're going to organize people to be able to do this. And let's think on an individual level, what mindsets and biases do we need to reflect and change in individual people?
Given the uncertainties and maybe the vagaries in the U.S. economy, and having friends and colleagues who are affected by downturns in their organization, is there more or less appetite for this work today? What's your sense of that?
Oh, fascinating question, especially as we our job, new jobs report. Seems like the economy is still strong. We're trying to debate about whether or not we're going to go into recession, right? Like, I don't know. Like right now, the demand seems pretty strong. I think that we have seen it fluctuate, not just over the last few years because of the pandemic, or not just over the last year because of recession scares, but so much of it is individualized to what do the employees want to be working on? Where are they pushing the organization forward? What do the leaders care about? Does a leader prioritize this kind of work? And also, there's obviously some of this is driven by the news cycle. Like if we have another George Floyd, for example, we're going to be having a conversation about the experience of Black employees and inclusion again, no matter if people want that to be the conversation or not.
No, it's a conversation we need to continue to have. I mean, given all kinds of legacies, right?
Absolutely. But people are starting to deprioritize DEI budgets right now, and chief diversity officers are being laid off. And it's just all of that's being included in this big like conversation about layoffs. But is it cyclical? I think so. Like we're going to be rehiring some of those people would be my guess. So right now, that's a long way of answering your question. Demand still seems to be strong, but I think we also have a diversified portfolio of kind of work that we do and kind of clients that we work with, and that is helpful.
And Caleb Gardner, so fascinating. And what I am interested in, and I'm sure that folks in our listening audience are interested in as well, is how do I start with someone, like 18 Coffees? I mean, do I have to be a Fortune 50 company or, have very deep pockets? Or I know that through your book, No Point B, that I can connect with ideas there. But where do I start if I want to, engage in the kind of work and services that you're offering?
Oh, that's such a fun question. Thank you for asking it.
You're welcome.
I would say that there is a typical profile of the kind of clients we work with, but all of our clients have not matched this, which means that, we really care more about the work than we do exactly what our client profiles look like. But they usually look like you said, a Fortune 50 enterprise that wants to do some kind of big change work that is very hard to tackle internally for whatever, reasons of bureaucracy or whatever reasons.
Well, often you just don't have that picture that an external resource has. I mean, it's more difficult to see your culture when you're inside it.
100%. Yeah. And we can just be that mirror back to the organization. So there's that. And then we work with a lot of larger nonprofit or philanthropic groups, people that are already kind of mission oriented, to our point earlier, but just need some help being more innovative, moving faster, like all those, typical kinds of innovation initiative things. So, but we've also worked with smaller nonprofits. We've worked with startups. Like I said, we're kind of conceptualizing and launching a few orgs right now. Like the work, I think, to us really matters more than and obviously our budgets, of course, matter more to us than the specific kind of profile. But I would say some smaller bites at the apple. If you are a smaller org, like I do quite a bit of speaking and training myself, and just being able to, inspire an org and come in and stir the pot a little bit and get them to think about problems differently is always a good place to start, because I think it reframes problems and can often say, oh, there is this bigger scope of work that we need to eventually create resources for. So that can be a good entry point as well.
And as we begin to think about wrapping up in a conversation and a dialogue that could certainly go on for much longer, and I encourage people to look for No Point B for some guidance and direction in that regard. What do you see as some of the most significant challenges in creating community and building strong culture today among your clients?
Oh, man. Besides for some of the ones we've already talked about, right? Like in terms of the effects of the internet, I think part of the problem is we are moving on so many fronts and we are putting out so many fires that we just haven't created capacity to step back and see the bigger picture. I think that's been endemic to a lot of our business environment for, years and years and years, but is especially prominent now that we are having to deal with all these outside influences and, thinking about things like Web3 and crypto, and just like wrapping your head around some of these bigger trends is very hard for a business leader to do and see the potential implications for disruption for their organizations. So we're dealing with multifaceted, really challenging problems on several different fronts. And it gets very hard to focus on them in the day-to-day fires that are burning in our organization. I think that's absolutely true. I also think there's a generational divide that we are seeing right now between people who are technologically savvy, more diverse, more prioritizing inclusion, prioritizing also just the recontextualization of their work in their lives in really interesting ways that we're seeing in younger generations. And we're seeing that our organizations are often still run by older generations that don't speak the same. There's just a cultural divide, right? They don't speak the same language. They didn't grow up in the same kind of management environment. So there's a lot of just training we're doing around what I would call inclusive leadership, right? Just catching people up to like, here's what's happening. Here's what younger generations care about. And here's how they want to be managed. And here's how we can find some middle ground here. That, and I would say just the continued intersection of some of the like social justice, political, social advocacy things with the business environment. There's lots of conversations about quote unquote woke capitalism happening right now, about ESG investing, about just the role of corporations in public life that I think are going to be disruptive for a while.
Caleb, so fascinating and encouraging everyone to dig into No Point B and to learn more about 18 Coffees. If just as a final question, if you were to help or provide some guidance or advice on finding your authentic voice in all of this, or helping an organization to find its authentic voice, what would be some of the advice or guidance that you might offer?
I would start from first principles, right? What do you believe in? What do you care about? What's related to the industry that you're in? What are your employees telling you? Like, I just do some research, try to figure out what do we believe in? Why do we exist? Like, do some of that foundational work, like take the corporate equivalent of peyote in the desert, like, and just think big picture and remember why you're here. And then try to document some of that, like try to write it down, try to use actual language. Because I think that, at least for me, the process of documenting that and writing it and having people react to it helps keep us on the same page when we're saying things like, we want to be a more inclusive organization. Cool. Well, what does that mean? Like, let's talk about it. Let's start putting on paper like how we're actually going to do that.
Caleb Gardner, you really drive home your messages about curiosity and bring a focus to change. And it's an absolute delight to have you as a guest on Authentic Change with Mike Horn, and to hear the wisdom and the direction and the guidance that you're providing to not only your clients, but to all of us through your work. So Caleb, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a fascinating conversation.
And until the next episode of Authentic Change with Mike Horn, stay well.
Thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast. I'm delighted that you've tuned in to listen. Please visit the show notes for links to topics discussed in today's podcast. To download a free ebook on authentic change and leadership and to subscribe to my newsletter, please visit mike-horn.com. Once again, mike-horne.com, mike-horn.com. Once again, thank you for listening to the Authentic Change podcast.